the final choice that locked the legacy in place. Every long story of power eventually narrows down to a single moment where momentum gives way to permanence, where choices stop being reversible and begin to define how history will remember what came before. This was that moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way few decisions ever are. This story matters today because legacies are rarely secured at the height of success. They are secured at the edge of transition, when growth has slowed, scrutiny has intensified, and the temptation to protect what already exists competes with the opportunity to shape what comes next. In modern business, the final choice is often less about expansion and more about consolidation of influence. By the time this decision arrived, the empire already looked complete from the outside. Markets recognized its dominance. Competitors had adapted around it. Institutions treated its presence as a constant rather than a challenger. Most observers assumed the hard work was finished, that the remaining years would be about maintenance rather than strategy. But internally, the picture was different. The final choice was still unresolved. Not about scale or ambition, but about structure, about whether control would remain flexible enough to evolve, or rigid enough to survive without its original architects. The difference between temporary dominance and enduring legacy rested entirely on how this moment was handled. At the center of the decision was a trade-off that offered no perfect answer. One path preserved optionality, but invited uncertainty. The other locked in outcomes, while closing doors that could never be reopened. Both carried risk. Only one carried finality. What made this choice uniquely powerful was timing. It arrived after competitors had exhausted their alternatives, after markets had stabilized, and after influence had already been embedded into systems that no longer needed reinforcement. The environment was ready for permanence. All that remained was to decide its shape. This was not a decision driven by urgency. It was driven by awareness. Awareness that some advantages compound only if they are fixed. That flexibility, once valuable, eventually becomes noise. And that legacies are not built by endless movement, but by knowing when movement should stop. As this choice approached, everything that had come before began to converge toward a single outcome. And once it was made, there would be no going back. The period leading up to the final choice was marked by an unusual stillness, not because there were no options left, but because every remaining option carried consequences that would echo far beyond the present moment. Discussions slowed. Proposals were revisited repeatedly. What once would have been decided quickly was now examined from every angle, because this was no longer about optimization, but about permanence. Advisors framed the decision in technical terms: governance structures, succession mechanics, control thresholds, risk insulation. Each model promised stability in one direction, while introducing vulnerability in another. The difficulty was not a lack of information, but an excess of it, all pointing to the same truth. This choice would outlive the people making it. Externally, pressure mounted in subtle ways. Investors wanted reassurance. Partners sought clarity. Institutions pushed for predictability. Everyone favored certainty, because certainty reduces friction. But certainty also hardens outcomes, turning strategy into architecture. Once built, that architecture would shape behavior. Without permission, internally, the debate centered on control. Not who held it today, but who would hold it tomorrow. Whether influence would remain adaptable or be locked into formal mechanisms designed to survive transition, scrutiny, and time itself. The more the implications were explored, the clearer the trade-off became. Flexibility preserved optional futures. Finality preserved power. What made the moment especially heavy was the awareness that delaying further would change nothing. The environment had already stabilized. Competitors had already adjusted. Markets had already priced in permanence. Waiting longer would not create new information. It would only defer responsibility. As discussions continued, a quiet consensus began to form, not around what felt safest, but around what felt inevitable. The system no longer needed guidance. It needed a lock. This realization shifted the tone completely. The question stopped being whether to make the final choice. It became when and how decisively. And as the weight of that understanding settled in, the legacy itself began to take shape, long before the decision was ever announced. The conflict intensified as a final choice drew closer, not because opposing sides emerged, but because the implications became impossible to soften or postpone. What had once been framed as strategic preference now revealed itself as an irreversible commitment that would determine not only outcomes, but the rules by which all future outcomes would be judged. Inside leadership discussions, tension came from alignment rather than disagreement. Everyone understood the risks. Everyone recognized the trade-offs. The unease came from knowing that there would be no opportunity to revise a decision later, no market shift or external shock that could be used to justify reversal. Once made, the choice would stand on its own. The emotional peak formed around a sobering realization. Control had reached its natural limit. Expansion was no longer the challenge. Preservation was. The empire no longer needed to prove itself through action. It needed to define how it would exist without constant intervention. Two paths remained. One allowed continued adjustment at the cost of uncertainty and vulnerability during transition. The other sacrificed flexibility in exchange for durability, embedding influence into formal structures that would function long after the original decision-makers stepped aside. Neither path was free of risk, but only one ensured continuity. External forces sharpened the dilemma. Regulatory attention increased. Public scrutiny intensified. Market expectations hardened. The environment that once rewarded innovation now demanded reliability. The more stable the system became, the less tolerant it was of ambiguity. At this stage, the conflict was not about competition. It was about identity, about whether the legacy would be defined by adaptability or by endurance, by evolution or by permanence. As the final discussions unfolded, it became clear that the choice would not be judged by immediate results. It would be judged by how well it survived time, pressure, and succession. The future was no longer hypothetical. It was being engineered. And as that understanding settled across the room, the final choice moved from consideration to inevitability. The climax arrived the moment the final choice was made, not because anything visibly changed, but because nothing could change again. With a single decision, flexibility was traded for permanence, and influence was no longer something that needed to be exercised. It was embedded, fixed into structures designed to outlast people, cycles, and uncertainty itself. What followed was not disruption, but calm. Markets responded predictably. Institutions adjusted without resistance. Competitors accepted the new reality because there was no longer a mechanism to challenge it. The legacy had moved beyond strategy and into architecture, where power no longer competes. It simply exists. The decision locked outcomes into place by removing ambiguity. Control was no longer personal or situational. It was procedural. Succession became manageable. Scrutiny became survivable. What had once required constant judgment now operated automatically, guided by rules rather than intent. This is how legacies endure, not by continuing to win, but by eliminating the conditions under which losing is possible. The final choice did not maximize upside. It minimized vulnerability. It accepted that growth had limits, but permanence did not. Looking back, it is tempting to search for drama in the final act, but the truth is quieter. The most important decisions often feel anticlimactic because their power lies in what they prevent, not in what they create. By the time the world notices, the outcome has already been stabilized. This is why the story matters now, because every empire eventually reaches a moment where movement must stop, where adaptability gives way to durability, and where legacy becomes a question of structure rather than ambition. Those moments rarely announce themselves. They feel like administration. They feel like caution, but they decide everything. So what do you think? When power reaches its peak, is locking in the smartest move or the most dangerous one? The